Welcome, sleepy traveler. You've arrived at a quiet space made just for you. My name is Valarie, and I am here to guide you gently into rest, to help ease your mind, soften your body, and drift you toward a peaceful, uninterrupted sleep. Whether your day was long or your thoughts feel a little too loud tonight, let this be your permission to slow down, to breathe, and to simply be. There's nothing more to do now. Just allow my voice to be your guide as we begin this gentle journey toward deep, nourishing rest. If you're new here, subscribe for sleep content like this, and like this video if you find it enjoyable. Let's begin. Take in a slow, gentle breath and let it out softly, as if you are releasing the weight of the day. Feel the air moving in and out, natural and effortless. There is nothing to change, nothing to control. Just the soothing rhythm of your own breathing. Notice the surface beneath you. It is holding you fully and safely. Your body can surrender to this support completely. With each exhale, imagine yourself sinking just a little deeper, as if the earth itself is embracing you in comfort. You are safe to rest here. Bring your awareness to your face. Smooth your forehead, letting go of the day's expressions. Your eyebrows soften, your eyelids grow heavier. The small muscles around your eyes release. Your cheeks soften and your jaw loosens with ease. Even your tongue rests quietly in your mouth. Your entire face is calm and at peace. Take another easy breath. And bring your attention to your neck and shoulders. Feel their weight. Notice if they are holding on to tension. Then let that tension melt away as you exhale. Your shoulders drop naturally, soft and heavy. Warmth spreads through your upper arms, down through your elbows, forearms, and into your hands. Your fingers are loose and still, free of effort. Your chest rises gently with each inhale and falls softly with each exhale. Your heartbeat is slow and steady, a quiet lullaby within you. Every breath carries away a little more of the day. Every breath invites you deeper into calm. Now let your awareness drift to your stomach and lower back. Let your belly soften completely, free of any holding. Feel your lower back releasing, sinking into the support beneath you. From your shoulders down to your hips, every muscle is letting go. Bring attention to your hips and thighs. They feel heavy, warm, and deeply relaxed. Your knees, calves, and shins follow, softening naturally. Even your ankles and feet are free of tension. Each toe is soft, each foot resting easily. From the top of your head to the tips of your toes, you are at ease. Now imagine a soft golden light above your head. It glows warmly, gentle and comforting. The light slowly begins to drift down, touching the crown of your head. Every place it touches fills with peace and softness. The golden light flows across your forehead and temples, down over your closed eyes and cheeks. It reaches your jaw, releasing any last bits of tension. Your entire face glows with serenity. The light drifts down to your neck and shoulders. Melting away the heaviness of the day. It moves along your arms to your wrists and into your fingertips. Every muscle it touches loosens and softens. The golden light continues to your chest and heart, filling you with warmth, comfort, and safety. It spreads through your lungs, ribs, and belly, moving with your breath. The glow flows down into your hips and thighs, over your knees, calves, and ankles. Finally, it reaches your feet and toes, surrounding your whole body. You are now cocooned in golden light, wrapped in calm and ease. Take a slow, deep breath and let it out gently, feeling yourself sink even deeper. You are completely relaxed, completely safe. In your mind, imagine you are lying under a vast night sky. The air is cool and fresh, carrying the scent of night blossoms. The ground beneath you is soft, like a welcoming bed of grass. Above you, the first stars twinkle in the darkness. One by one, more appear, filling the sky with gentle light. A crescent moon rises slowly, its silver glow washing over you. The light feels protective, a quiet guardian in the night. Somewhere nearby, a stream trickles softly over smooth stones. Its gentle song blends with the whisper of the breeze. Every part of nature around you is calm and soothing. The night is holding you, keeping you safe. You are a part of this peaceful, endless sky. If a thought drifts into your mind, imagine it as a soft cloud. It floats in gently and moves on without effort. You are free to let every thought drift away. Your mind is a clear, open sky, vast and peaceful. Take another slow inhale. And a long, soft exhale. Feel how deeply your body has surrendered to rest. You are heavy, warm, and safe. Your mind is light, floating in gentle stillness. You are drifting now, moving effortlessly towards sleep. Held by the night, wrapped in warmth and calm. Every star above feels like a lullaby welcoming your dreams. There's nothing left to do. No effort, no thought, only the sweet surrender of rest. Good night. Rest deeply and enjoy tonight's bedtime story. I didn't come here to be saved by a lighthouse, only to catch my breath in its shadow. But the first thing it did was drag me into a story that might have been waiting for me all along. I told myself that sentence out loud as I cut the engine and let the late morning wind rush through my cracked car window. The road had ended in a patchwork of gravel and wildflowers, the cliff splaying open beyond it like a held breath. The lighthouse stood at the edge with an old dog's stubborn dignity, white paint flaking like snowfall, iron railings salted with rust. I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, my heart thudding hard enough to seem like it belonged to the ocean. 30 days, I had promised myself. 30 days away from the client briefs and the half-finished logo iterations and the fluorescent office kitchen where my ex once said too quietly, "I think we want different lives." He was probably right. I just hadn't known that mine would include a lighthouse once owned by a great uncle I only remembered from a photograph. A tall man in a fisherman's sweater with the kind of smile that made you feel seen. When his name surfaced in the family group chat, "Uncle Jakob's lighthouse," my aunt wrote, and my mother answered, "I can't believe it's been sitting empty." It landed in me like a tide. The town council wanted to restore it, make it safe, maybe even open it to visitors. They needed hands. I had a pair, restless and cracked as old paint. So I said I'd come. The wind tasted like cold metal and pine as I stepped out of the car. I pulled my jacket tighter and started the walk up the path, brush scraping my ankles, gulls calling like children who knew better secrets. The lighthouse rose with each step, a singular, stubborn geometry against the sky. At its base, the door was swollen and green, sea-watered. The key from the town council turned with a long complaint, and the smell hit me as soon as the door cracked. Salt, damp, old rope, and something like the inside of an antique trunk. "Hi," I said, ridiculous, to nothing and no one. "I'm Erica. I'm here to make you pretty again." A moth tumbled out past me and into the light. I went inside. The main room was larger than I'd imagined. A circular space with a utilitarian beauty. Hooks along the walls, a cast-iron stove sunk into the corner, and a work table that looked carved by a steady, unshowy hand. A spiral staircase wormed upward through the center like a spine. Dust haloed in the air. I thought of the clients whose emails had turned my life into a long scroll of demands and deadlines. Fix this, adjust that, make it pop. Here, nothing needed popping. It needed patience. I set my backpack on the table and unpacked what I had. A thermos of coffee, a bag of supermarket cookies, gloves, rags, a scrub brush, a bottle of cleaning spray that suddenly seemed comically urban in the face of centuries of salt. Outside, waves struck rock with casual violence. Inside, if I listened hard, I could hear the old building creak like a person stretching after a long sleep. Okay, I told myself. Start with the cobwebs. Always start with the cobwebs. I found a broom leaning against the wall, its straw warped to one side like a cowlick. I swept the corners and the baseboards, sending spiders into diplomatic relocation. I wiped down the hooks, the sill of the single low window, the stovetop. On the shelf above the stove sat a huddle of rusted lanterns and a chipped blue mug that looked scandalized by its own survival. I took the mug down, set it on the table, and inhaled, for no reason at all, a memory of Sunday mornings in my old apartment. Coffee, the hum of a blender in the unit upstairs, music that my ex would play so low we'd have to lean in to hear. Different lives, I said softly. Okay. I climbed the first curve of the staircase. It was steeper than I expected, the railing cold under my palm. Halfway up, a small landing appeared. A storage shelf tucked beneath the stairs, its boards puffed with age. A broken oilskin slicker hung on a peg like the ghost of a fisherman. Beyond that, the next level bloomed open into another room, a narrow circle with a cot along the wall, a trunk at its foot, a small window smudged by salt. Someone had slept here once. In my great-uncle's photo, his sweater looked soft enough to steal. I could see him climbing these same steps, a kettle in hand, turning a knob to tend the light. The light. I craned my neck, trying to see upward. The stairs continued, tight and purposeful, closing the distance to the lantern room. Later, I told myself. The main room first. The living ordinary things first. The big symbolic stuff after. Back downstairs, I took a break. I sat on the step with my thermos and cracked the lid. The smell of coffee warmed me from the inside out. The door was still open, held in place by a rock, and a ribbon of wind came and went as if the building itself were breathing. That's when I saw it. The corner of something different beneath the shelf with the rusted lanterns. Not wood, not rope. The edge of a spine, smooth and dark against the gray. I set my coffee down and knelt, pressuring my knees into the familiar ache of a childhood spent on carpets and floors. My hand slid into dust and grit, then closed around leather. It came free with a little sigh. The book was small enough to slip into a coat pocket, the leather soft and scarred as if it had lived several lives. I brushed it with the sleeve of my jacket and a faint design appeared, an outline of a lantern pressed into the cover like a quiet promise. The first page stuck for a breath, then opened. The paper inside was thick, smattered with the freckles of age. On the first leaf, in a neat hand, guests of the light below it, a line in smaller script. If you cannot speak, write. If you cannot write, rest. Well, I said to the wind, to the gull that peered in bold as a neighbor, I guess I'm a guest. I turned the page. The earliest entries were dated in the 1950s and most were short. Pens had bled blue and black and once an obstinate green. All of them began with a date, then a sentence or two, sometimes a sketch, an arc of waves, a rope coiled like a sleeping snake. a tiny lighthouse drawn with shaky pride, and the words, oh, the words. I came here to think about a love I let slip away. I hope the sea carries my dreams to someone listening. Today the foghorn sounded like a church bell, and I decided that I am not ruined. I read until my coffee cooled, then I read until the wind picked up, and then I read until the gull's calls smudged into the sound of turning pages. The entries leapt decades at a time, 1963, 1970, 1988. Each voice had its own temperature. A fisherman who had lost a brother, a school teacher visiting in winter to watch the ice make lace, a woman who had come to the cliff with a ring in her pocket and left it on the beach. Offered back to time, she wrote, because time was the original jeweler. By the time the entries reached the 90s, I was sitting cross-legged on the floor with the book balanced on my knees like a secret I wasn't sure belonged to me. I didn't plan to cry, but one line arrived and opened the door cleanly. I was supposed to get married here, wrote someone on June 17th, 1994. The lighthouse was to be the witness. Instead, the gulls were. They do not file paperwork, but they keep good watch. I think maybe that's what I needed all along, a witness who does not ask for anything in return. I blinked until the page blurred, my vision misting the drawn edge of a gull mid-flight. Of all the parties not to ask anything of you, the ocean would win. It demands everything, and yet it takes what it wants without permission. No bridesmaids, no witnesses, and still seen. I closed the book and laid my palm on the leather. The impression of the lantern warmed under my hand. "Okay," I whispered. "I hear you." A door at the base of grief opened in me then. Not the hulking metal door I'd braced my shoulder against for months, the one that kept all the sharp things somewhere out of sight. This was thinner, gentler, a door into a room where the sharp things had rounded edges. My ex, with his careful carefulness, our silent breakfasts at the end, the moment in the office kitchen when he had looked at the floor and said he wanted different things, and I had started laughing because my heart had gone loud with panic. We'd parted with a plain decency that made it almost worse. No villain to point at, only two people startled by their own honesty. I opened the book again, as if it might answer a question I hadn't formed. The entries made a chorus, not always harmonious, but bright in their own small ways. A boy who came with his father to watch the storm and learned the names of waves. A woman who slept on the cot when the house she'd shared for 40 years felt too empty. A note in a child's scribble. I saw a mermaid. Someone had added later in different handwriting, "I did not, but I wanted to." I laughed, wiped my face with my sleeve, laughed again. "Same," I told them all. "Same." The day tilted its head toward afternoon. Clouds gathered their robes. I set the book gently on the table and did the simplest thing I could think of. I kept cleaning. I wiped the table with slow circles until the wood grain reappeared like the lines on an old friend's palm. I shook out a blanket from the cot and pinned it on a rope I strung near the door. I brushed sand from the corners until the room looked less abandoned and more like a place waiting for company. I lit one of the lanterns after a tentative test of the wick. Don't worry, I checked it properly. The town had left instructions for safe use. Its small flame stitched the room together. The lighthouse, not yet alive in its tower, had a heartbeat again on the ground. When I returned to the table, the guest book seemed to be leaning toward me. I half expected a new line to have appeared on its own, something like, "Welcome, Erica, don't be afraid." Nothing had changed, of course, except the pitch of daylight. I turned to the back. The final entries were sporadic, one or two a year, as if the world had busied itself elsewhere. The second to last was dated 3 summers ago. A school group had visited with a guide. The kids had eaten sandwiches on the floor and left the crusts on the table like punctuation marks. A chaperone had written, "I forgot how good it feels to be near something that keeps watch, even when nothing is in danger." And beneath it, in an unhurried hand on a winter date 2 years ago, "The wind is an old friend. It comes whether I call it or not. I don't know if this lighthouse has work left in it, but I know I do." If anyone reads this, please, keep the light if you can, not for ships, for people, for those of us who never learned to call ourselves home. No name. The letters had the patient drag of someone writing through a coat. I traced the sentence with my eyes. Keep the light if you can. My hands did the ridiculous thing of touching my own sternum, as if to check whether a bulb was there. Ridiculous. And yet, outside the sea reached and retreated, rehearsing itself for night. I stood and stretched. The staircase waited. The lantern room waited. And the little brass mechanisms that had once held the light steady against the sway of storms. I slipped the guest book into my backpack. Not to steal it, but to keep it safe from the evening damp until I could find a better place on one of the cleaner shelves. The climb was closer this time. The stairs were still steep, still honest about their intentions. I kept one hand on the rail and gained the next level, where the cot room yawned softly. Another circle's worth of steps brought me to a hatch door, which opened into the lantern room. It felt like stepping onto a ship's deck after being below too long. Windows ran all the way around. The glass was filmed with salt. In every direction the world declared itself. The mechanism stood at the center, a prism glass assembly like a sleeping eye. From the town notes I knew the old lens was still intact, though its lighting had been replaced and disabled long ago. Regulations, funding, all the reasonable bureaucratic things. Still, I rested my fingertips on the cold brass frame and felt a skip of awe. How many storms had this room watched? How many boats had glanced up and articulated their gratitude with a hand on a wheel? Directly beneath the windows, a faded bench traced the circle. I sat on it and did nothing for a luxurious amount of time. Through the fogged glass, the ocean was a textured gray, the horizon softened like a pencil line smudged by a thumb. The wind worked itself into all the old cracks and sang. "Hi," I told the lighthouse again because it seemed to be listening. "It's me. I think we're going to get along." I tried to imagine my great uncle here, not in the romantic myth of a keeper, but in the ordinary geography of a day. Lukewarm tea, sore ankles, a stubborn spot of rust he couldn't stand another minute, the relief of light switching on, the private pleasure of a job that shows you in measurable miles where you don't want people to crash. Below me, the main room glowed faintly with the lantern I'd lit. Above me, the sky tested different kinds of gray. I pictured my office chair, the ergonomic cushion I'd ordered in an optimistic burst, the rows of tabs open on my laptop like little mouths. I had loved design once the way a person loves a winter hobby, obsessed to a uselessly endearing degree. Lately it felt like trying to patch a sail while a storm laughed in my teeth. I'd tried to rebrand us, my ex and me. New palette, softer typography. You can't ease kerning into compatibility. Some letters don't want to sit together. A gull slapped against the glass and skittered away, leaving the suggestion of a feather. I startled, then laughed at myself. My laughter sounded braver in the round room, as if the building took it and sent it back polished. On my way down the stairs, I stopped again in the cot room. The trunk at its foot looked like all trunks, promising, impossible. Its metal clasp had stiffened with decades of air. I pressed, jigged the side, coaxed. It lifted with a groan that felt like breaking a promise and making a new one at the same time. Inside were the ordinary treasures of caretakers, a coil of line, a toolkit, a folded blanket with the stripes of an old army surplus store. And beneath those, wrapped in waxed paper, something I recognized by shape even before I opened it. A guest book twin. I held my breath and unwrapped another leather-bound book, simpler than the one downstairs, unadorned by a lantern stamp. I opened it. Blank. My first thought was greedy. I could keep one for myself. A private volume for whatever words would not go into the book for strangers. But a second thought came on the heels of the first. Maybe that was never the point. This wasn't about making separate rooms in which to be a person. Maybe the work now, mine, the lighthouse's, was about letting the rooms talk to one another. I put the blank book back. I took the folded blanket instead, shook it out, and spread it over the cot. The fabric smelled like a closet at the back of a childhood. I sat down. I was suddenly very tired, but a good tired. the kind that comes from work that is its own explanation. Downstairs, I made myself eat 2 supermarket cookies, which tasted happily like cardboard and sugar. I wrote a note on a scrap of paper for no one. I was here today, and I made the table clean. Then, in a burst of courage that felt like wading into water up to my chin, I took the guest book from my bag and opened the most recent page. The paper listens. That's how it felt. I clicked my pen, an automatic motion, like a nervous tick, and wrote, September 12th. I had to check my phone. Every day here already feels like its own season. I came here to get away from the noise I made by calling it a life. My heart is loud in this quiet place. I don't know what I'm keeping yet. Light, promises, old wounds. But I know I want to keep something. If you are reading this, I hope you found a corner here where your breath got easier. If the sea is listening, I hope it takes this and gives back what we need. I hesitated, then added, because it seemed honest. P.S. I design things for a living. I forgot what it's like to make something that doesn't ask to be liked. I signed my name. It looked small at the bottom of the page. I pressed my palm to the paper, as if the warmth of my hand could set the ink. Evening arrived by rearranging the light. The lantern's small flame gathered itself. I stood at the door and watched the horizon tighten into a dark thread, the sky answering with colors even the sea had to admire. Sometimes the ocean seemed to lean in to see what the sky would do next. A man appeared on the path from town unexpectedly, 2 grocery bags in his hands. He walked like a person who knows where his feet are. When he reached the door, he held the bags up like a peace offering. "You must be Erica," he said. "Council meeting said you were coming today. I'm Matteo. I brought pasta and a jar of sauce. First lighthouse dinner is philosophical, but it should also be edible." It took him exactly 30 seconds to feel like someone who belonged in the doorway of a lighthouse. He had wind-red cheeks and a sweater with a hole thumbed at the cuff. He did not look surprised to find a woman with dust on her face and a guest book in her hands. This is perfect," I blurted. "Thank you, I didn't plan that far." First rule of keeping, you're always a little hungry. Second rule, the wind is a gossip, but it doesn't mean everything it says. He set the groceries down and looked around as if he were measuring the room for a memory. His gaze landed on the lantern, then the table, then the shelf where the rusted lanterns had stood in their dusty congress. "You did this today?" he asked. "Most of it. The rest of it did itself." "Nice work," he said simply. He meant it. It landed in me like a soft stone. He made dinner while I hovered, chopping garlic with a knife that belonged to the house and boiling water in a pot that protested like an old man. We ate at the table, elbows in, steam rising in the cold air. Matteo told me about the town in a way that made it sound like a secret map. Who to ask for good bread, who to avoid when they started a story because they could not end it, how the coast looked in winter, the ice doing its lace work, the way some people leave and call it freedom and some people stay and call it the same. "You're not from here," I said. "Came 3 years ago," he replied. "Thought I'd be a month. Found one good street and never left it." He asked about me, and I told him the short, careful version. City, graphic design, burnout like an inside joke I wasn't in on anymore. Heartbreak that left no theatrics, only a silence with edges. He nodded like a person who had personally met every word. When we were done, he washed dishes with the ease of someone who prefers to be useful. I dried. The wind had quieted, as if tired of hearing its own name. When the room had returned to clean bowls and leftover sauce, Matteo washed his hands, then tapped the guest book with a knuckle. "You found it," he said, almost reverent. "I hoped you would. You knew it was here. Everyone knows about it, and no one talks about it." He smiled, apologetic. "It's how you keep magic from getting shy." "It's beautiful," I said. "It's honest," he said. He waited, as if for an offer, and I turned it so he could read, though I felt suddenly naked. He ran his eyes over my page, not lingering indecently. He closed the book with care. "Welcome," he said. "You're a guest of the light now." He left with a wave and a promise to come by tomorrow with a ladder. After he disappeared down the path, I stood in the doorway and let the night come as close as it wanted. It did not rush me. The ocean worked in the dark like a living thing with good habits. I closed the door when the lantern's flame began to flicker its delicate warnings, tucked it safely out, and rolled the blanket on the cot down around my shoulders like a decision. I slept, eventually, not in the deep way that makes you forget your name, but in the gentle way that makes remembering your name feel like a tender act in the morning. I woke twice with the urge to climb to the lantern room. Once because of a dream in which my great-uncle walked the stairs barefoot and said nothing, just held up a thermos to cheers me, and once because the wind called my name the way only the wind can, as if trying it on to see if it fit. Both times I stayed where I was. The third time I woke to the scent of early light. Morning was a map of pale colors. The cliff wore a shawl of mist. I made coffee and drank it perched on the step, the door open to the day. The guest book sat on the table, patient. I touched it just once as if to confirm. Yes, the words were still there. I had come to the lighthouse like a person holding her breath as long as she could under water, hoping for the clean hurt of returning to air. What I had found was less dramatic and more dangerous. I had found a room full of other people's breath, carefully laid down and preserved, and the quiet truth that their lungs made mine less lonely. The entries spanned decades, yes, but they also spanned griefs I recognized in my body. Love lost, hope mailed out like a letter with no return address, the small daily bravery of choosing to keep watch even when there were no ships in sight. I was not yet saved. I did not need to be. But something in me, some thin lantern I had ignored for years, had been relit. It burned with an unglamorous steadiness. It did not ask to be liked. It simply asked to be kept. The town would come. The council, with their ladders and safety rails and funding paperwork. The volunteers with their buckets and stubbornness. Mateo with his jokes about the wind and his quiet eyes that saw without rummaging. We would scrape and sand and paint. We would name the rust and call it by its better name, patina. We would argue gently about where to put the donated bench for visitors to sit and watch the horizon pretend to be a straight line. I would design a sign, because this was still my life, and I knew how to make letters stand with dignity. I would answer emails with less apology. I would start a list of the things that belong to people whether they ask for them or not. Time, water, attention. I would climb the stairs when the weather allowed and listen to the glass think about age. And I would keep the book, not as its owner, but as its reader and contributor and tender. I would make a shelf for it above the table and set a pencil beside it with a string tied in a loop so it couldn't wander far. I would leave a note on the first page that was not a rule, but an invitation. If you cannot speak, write. If you cannot write, rest. If you can do neither, sit. The light will do some of the work. I ran a hand over the table and felt it clean again beneath my palm. Then I took the broom and went to the corners, humming a tune with no name. The lighthouse breathing slowly around me, the ocean practicing its promising repetition. The wind pressed a damp kiss on the doorframe and moved on. I didn't come here to be saved by a lighthouse, but I had come here, and that was enough for now. The light at the edge of the wind wasn't a miracle. It was a job. It needed doing. And somewhere in the steady doing of it, a person named Erica, 29 and tired and not yet ruined, began the simple, unshowy work of keeping watch, over the room, over the book, over herself. I didn't mean to answer a stranger, I only meant to listen. But some nights the words lift their faces like tilted seashells, and you can't help but put your mouth to them and speak back. By the second week, my days were practical and salted, sanding rails with Mateo while the wind tried to steal our hats, scrubbing the salt film from the lantern room's glass with a rag that always turned gray, learning which steps creaked like old knees and which were quiet enough to betray a person coming up behind you. My evenings, though, belonged to the book. Light or no light, I'd end up at the table, knees drawn under me, elbows planted, reading about lives salted in their own ways. I discovered that the guest book was not chronological, at least not in any strict sense. Decades stepped over each other the way people do in a doorway. After you, no, after you. And the result was a conversation that made no linear sense and yet made every kind of sense. Some entries were only names and dates, as if the act of writing yourself at the lighthouse were enough of a sentence. Some tried on poetry and wore it well. Some were plain as a bucket. I brought my father's watch, someone had written in 1961, their letters boxy and precise. I wound it and listened for it to say I was not late, but it didn't know my appointments. "It's been 3 years," said a page that had bled its ink in the rain. I thought the boat would carry me out. I was wrong. It carried me back. I left a letter under the second step for someone who will never know I left it, a 1980 hand confessed. If you find it, it's not for you, but it can keep you company anyway. The reading became a habit with the regularity of tea. I'd rinse off the day at the tiny town rental, an attic apartment above a bakery that smelled like tomorrow's loaf, then walk back to the cliff while the evening softened. The path learned my feet. The gulls learned my jacket. Inside, I'd light the lantern on the table, a small flame trying its brave best, and open the book to wherever it wanted me. There were rhythms, fishermen in the winters of long ago, clutching thermoses and writing about weather with the intimacy of a lover describing a freckle. Teachers in April, when classes stretched thin and the lighthouse offered a thesis in stillness. A cluster of entries in the late 90s where people mentioned a local band that played on the beach at sunset, leaving footprints like eighth notes. That made me smile. There are always summers that think they're the first ones to be beautiful. As I read other people, the ache in me found a shape that wasn't just hurt. It was a geography, a recess, a curve of coast that caught driftwood. It was what loneliness looks like when you hold it in the light. It's full of textures you missed in the dark. I hadn't moved to this town to be brave. I'd moved because my body demanded a smaller noise. In the city, everything startled me. Sirens, subway brakes, the way coffee shops didn't just hum but vibrated my bones. The breakup had been the final, gentle push. "You seem like a person," he had said, not unkindly, "who needs to hear the ocean more than she needs to hear me." I'd wanted to argue on principle. I'm a person who needs both, thank you. But I couldn't find proof. Here my proof came in the faces of long-ago strangers on paper. They had brought their failures to the lighthouse like offerings and left them without drama. A man whose wife died after 57 years wrote, "I am not trying to live without you. I am trying to live with the you who is everywhere." A girl in 1973 confessed, "I lied about a book I hadn't read and he laughed with me anyway." A woman in 2005 had brought a baby who didn't sleep and left a drawing of a tiny handprint with the caption, "Still here." The book didn't cure the hurt so much as give it posture. Reading made me sit more upright inside myself. It rained one afternoon while Matteo and I wrestled a new railing onto the stairs. Rain at the lighthouse is a complicated guest, neither fully inside nor outside. The wind wears its moisture like perfume, and everything smells like a wet anchor. We gave up before the bolts made a liar out of our optimism and started a pot of coffee in the old corner stove, an act of defiance and comfort all at once. "You look like you're writing conversations with ghosts," Matteo said, nodding toward the book on the table while we waited for the kettle. He'd seen me with it often enough to comment, but always with a respectful distance, as if he were mentioning a friend I might not want to share. "They're not ghosts," I said. "They're people who wrote with their coats on." "That's all a ghost ever is," he said, pleased with himself, and pulled 2 mugs off the shelf. One was the scandalized blue mug, the other had a chip that shaped itself into a heart if you squinted. "You ever add your own words?" "Not yet," I admitted. "Feels like walking into a conversation at a table and announcing yourself on the first breath." He shrugged and poured the coffee. "Sometimes you sit for a while and nod. Sometimes you say, 'Pass the salt.' Both are a kind of belonging." He left me with my mug and a smile and a new railing that leaned only a little. The rain turned the windows gray as unphotographed memories. That night everything blurred into fog. It rolled its own weather into the room, ribboned in through the open cracks like someone's breath. The lantern flame made a halo of itself. My hair frizzed. The pages in the book went soft at the edges and perfumed the air with old ink. It was a night that made silence feel like an extra person in the room. I flipped to a page I hadn't seen before and found, anchored down by a heavy hand, an entry from 1968 that made me sit up, even though sitting up at that point simply meant straightening the curve I'd folded into the chair. November 21st, 1968. "I am waiting for a letter," someone had written in a tidy slant, "that isn't coming." That feels different, I find, than waiting for a person. People you can see choosing not to come. Letters you can only imagine clinging to the bottom of the postal sack like a stubborn seed. I wrote it 3 times and sent none of them. If you're reading this, I regret both my silence and my imagination. There was no signature, just a pressed stitch of seaweed taped to the corner and a faint coffee ring that time had faded to a ghost of itself. I put my finger on the date. The ink caught a little in the softened paper. I pictured the writer, a man, I thought, though I couldn't tell why, standing in a post office, then not standing in a post office, then standing here instead, where the light chose its weather and the water made all the decisions. I pictured their quiet regret, an animal that doesn't howl but sits beside you with its head on your knee. I kept reading past it, because I didn't trust my heart not to announce itself with too much fanfare. The pages turned themselves into other years. A few entries later, 1974. I took off my engagement ring here and rolled it across the table, and it stopped at a splinter. Consider this my game of chance. 1982. I got the job. I wanted to tell someone who knew me before I had titles, so here you go. 1999. We left a picnic and 3 cigarette butts and an apology for both. We were 20 and didn't know yet how to love the world well. 2003. He came back from Iraq and we ate sandwiches in this room without talking, and that was better than any speech. 2017. You can hear whales if you pretend enough. But the waiting for a letter entry had put its hand on my shoulder and left it there. It moved with me as I turned pages. It stood with me when I refilled my tea. It walked with me to the door to check whether the fog had teeth. It sat again when I sat and laid its head neatly in my lap. The thing about loneliness, when you finally admit its name, is that it becomes metabolizable. You can chew it. It won't nourish you, but it will be less likely to starve you. The book chewed with me. The fog made every sound feel like it was only a room away. I turned back to the page. I am waiting for a letter that isn't coming. If I'd had my old life here, with the late-night pings from clients, the alerts that made my stomach flip like a bad penny, the constant gentle performance of being fine, I might have scrolled past that line the way you scroll past everything you don't have the energy to meet. Instead, the room had nothing for me to do except be the person in it. The wind made a sound like a sweater being pulled over your head. The lantern's flame hopped and settled. Somewhere below, a rope protested the tightness with a soft, repetitive complaint. And then, before I could argue with the tenderness of it, I reached for the pencil we'd tied with string to the edge of the table, and I wrote beneath the decades-old entry. My hand shook. My words did not. September, fog, I started, because the calendar in here had moods, not numbers. To the one who was waiting for a letter that never came, I'm here now, and I hope you found peace. I stared at the sentence like an animal sniffing something new on the trail. It wasn't clever. It didn't try to fix or diagnose or rearrange. It just reached its hand backward and put it on the shoulder of a person who had already walked out of the room. The feeling of it, of making that reach, was small and enormous at the same time, the way a candle is. I added nothing else. The urge to explain is just a modern superstition. I pressed the page gently with my palm the way I had after my first entry. The act of replying let heat move through me, something unclenched. I pictured a room in time where the writer sat, letterless, and imagined my sentence floating above their head like a slow balloon, not to make them feel better, who knows what they needed, but to honor the fact that they needed it all. When I lifted my hand, the pencil line had smudged a little into the fog made damp. I didn't mind. It made my words look older than they were, and that, in this room, felt like camouflage. I closed the book gently. The lantern made its small, brave circle. Outside, the fog was a veil that turned even the nearest things into ideas. I stood at the window and watched the white world breathe. This must be what prayer feels like when you don't believe in anything but weather. Sleep came like fog, too, gradual, insinuating. I curled up on the cot upstairs, the army blanket square on my chest. In the night, I woke to the feeling that someone had sat down on the edge of the bed. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't want to assign it a shape and ruin it. I listened to the building, its old ribs, its patient lungs, and felt for the first time since arriving not simply away from the life I had, but toward the life I hadn't known how to want. Morning rose gray and then yellow. The fog tried a reticent retreat. I brewed coffee with yesterday's stubborn kettle and carried the mug outside. The cliff wore beads of water, each weed a jeweler's display. The sea, denied its horizon, looked pleased to be mysterious. Mateo's boots announced him before his face did. He came up the path humming a line of something that sounded like a song you make up when you don't want to think too hard. He had a thermos and a paper bag. "I come bearing provisions and gossip," he said. "What gossip?" I asked, taking the bag. It contained 2 pastries that the bakery downstairs in my building had begun to comp me for being, as the owner put it, the brave woman who stares down our cliff. "You wrote," he said, eyes flicking toward the room as if the walls themselves might tell him. He caught himself and adjusted, smiling. "Not you. Thought you might. Fog does that." "You can smell my guilt, is that it?" "I can smell pencil," he said, "and the particular kind of quiet you get after you say something simple and true." I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't want to give that knowledge less mystery than it deserved. We ate our pastries facing the fog like 2 friendly lizards on a rock. He talked about the council meeting. They'd found funding for new handrails. There was talk of a fall community day at the lighthouse, if we could get the stairs safe in time. Someone wanted to donate a bench. Someone wanted to paint it. Someone else had strong opinions about paint. He had a map of the wiring and a promise from a retired electrician who, according to Mateo, was equal parts wizard and liability. "Are you going to tell me what you wrote?" he asked finally, not pushing, just setting the question lightly on the table like a napkin. "I answered someone," I said. "A person waiting for a letter that never came." Mateo's shoulders softened. "People are letters that never came," he said, and then laughed at himself. "Listen to me. I'm the kind of tired that makes me say things I'll regret when I'm fully hydrated." I said I hoped they found peace, I told him. It felt tiny, but not nothing. "It's a candle," he said. We're all just candles in doorways trying not to go out. We went to work. The morning claimed its true weather, fog lifting, light trying on colors it hadn't worn yesterday. My reply inside the book went on being a reply without me watching it. That, too, felt important. I didn't need to babysit it. The act of leaving it was the act. The room took it into its old body and placed it where it belonged, among other small braveries. In the afternoons, I kept finding myself glancing at the book as if the page might have changed shape under the weight of my sentence. It looked ordinary. That was the point. The magic in this place wasn't showy. It was practical. It worked with glue and rope and graphite. Days folded. When fog returned, it always does, I answered another. Not page after page. That would be a different kind of hunger. But now and then, when an entry turned toward me and lifted its chin like a tilting shell, to the woman who left the ring on the table and called it a game of chance, I wrote 2 nights later, "It's many years after you, and the table is still sturdy. Maybe that was the answer all along." Dear 2003, I wrote beneath the soldier's sandwich. Sometimes not talking is the loudest company. I'm glad you had it. To the person who drew a mermaid, I scrawled in pencil like a conspirator. I haven't seen one either, but I'm getting better at wanting. And once, shyly beneath an entry from 1970 that read, "I hope the sea carries my dreams to someone listening," I replied, "I'm listening. Tell me what color." Each reply felt like placing a small candle in a corridor I was still learning to walk. I didn't light them in any pattern, but together they began to make a constellation of small flames that kept the drafts honest. The act of replying gave me a purpose that wasn't about accomplishment. It was about continuance. There were evenings when I didn't have it in me, nights when the ache of starting over turned sullen and heavy, and the words in the book felt like too many ghosts tugging at my sleeves. On those nights, I didn't write. I swept the floor, or I underlined someone else's sentence with the softest pencil pressure, breathing with them. And that was a reply too. One late afternoon, a woman came with her adolescent daughter to stare at the water and talk without saying much. They peered into the book because it felt like something you peer into when you're deciding how to say what you need. The daughter traced a drawing of a whale tail with a fingertip, then asked me if people still wrote in it. I said that they did. She nodded, satisfied, and drew, beside the whale, a cat. Then she wrote, in letters that insisted on their right to be round. Today was not all bad. Her mother touched her shoulder briefly and left 3 words under that. I love you. The book received them without fuss. I felt something in me unclench hard enough to make me sit down. The town began to feel me in it. I learned where the good apples hid in the grocery store and which evening held the least crowded laundromats. The woman at the bakery yelled at me for paying. "You're keeping our corner light," she said, handing me a bag with 2 extra pastries hidden as if I might not notice. "That earns you sugar." I designed a sign for the lighthouse's temporary fence in a font that didn't try too hard, and the council liked it so much they clapped at me. I waved them away so I wouldn't cry. At night I dreamed in pages, not words exactly, but the thick paper of the book, its weight against my palms, the way pencil sits on it like a politely dozing cat. I'd wake with the sensation of someone's sentence running lightly along my ribs, and the idea that I could answer it and not tip anything over. Sometime near the end of the month we'd marked as stare season, the fog came fierce again. It brought the smell of kelp and a sense that the world had turned itself into one large wool sweater. I lit the table lantern and, without ceremony, turned to the page where I'd replied to the letter waiter. A new line had joined ours beneath in careful modern script, and that made me startle enough to laugh out loud at my own nerves. "Matteo?" I thought, with a sudden protectiveness, as if I'd been caught talking to someone in private and now we were being chaperoned. But the hand was not his. The line read, "I don't know if I was the one waiting in 1968, but I was the one waiting in 1994. And I want to tell both of us that the letters arrive in other forms. You, reading this now, are one of mine. Thank you for answering." There was no name, only a small, drawn star. The graphite gleamed where the fog had kissed it. I sat back, the feeling like gravity had just changed its mind. Then I smiled into the empty room and felt not alone at all. Of course other people answered sometimes. Of course the corridor of little candles wasn't only my corridor. In a room that has learned to keep watch for decades, conversation is the measure of light. I put my palm down the way I always did. The book warmed under it. The fog pressed its cool face against the window. I wrote my tiniest reply yet. "I'll keep the light while I can." Then, because it felt right, I drew a tiny star of my own. When I blew out the lantern at the end of the night, the wick glowed red for a heartbeat before slipping into dark. That small surrender felt like a bow. I carried the hush upstairs and slept the kind of sleep that fills your body from the feet up, as if poured. Morning came clear and a little vain about it. The horizon snapped into a line a ruler would envy. From the lantern room, the world declared all its edges. Downstairs, the book waited without impatience, as it had for everyone who cared enough to bring their quiet here. I tied our pencil to its string a little tighter. I wiped the table with a damp rag, so the page would have a better place to rest. I made coffee. I climbed the stairs and checked the bolts we'd tightened. I stood at the window and watched a boat write a small sentence across the flat morning water. I hadn't come here to be anyone's witness. But sometimes you show up at the edge of the wind and find out you're exactly that. a person who reads, answers, and keeps a flame no bigger than a thumb alive, because it matters to those who come after. There would be other replies, other fogs, other evenings when the book would ask and I would say yes, and some when I would drink my tea and just be a human in a room with other humans' words. But that first night, the night I wrote to the one who waited for a letter that never came, was the first time I felt the lighthouse take me in as one of its small necessary pieces. Not a savior, not a martyr, a keeper of replies. And that was more purpose than I'd had in years. I didn't mean to answer a stranger, but the book opened, the fog breathed, the little flame learned my name, and my hand found the pencil the way a hand finds another hand in the dark, carefully, without dramatics, and relieved to discover it was already reaching back. Some buildings hold their silence like a wall. This one listens like a friend. By the third week, I had learned the lighthouse's moods. The way the stairs complained in the morning, the way the lantern glass looked smug on a sunny day, the particular hiss the stove made before it agreed to boil water. I'd also learned my own schedule here. Work in the daylight, words at night. It wasn't something I had planned. It simply happened, the way routines often do when you stop forcing them. Every evening after Matteo left, boots crunching back down the path, his voice tossed over his shoulder with some comment about the wind being extra gossipy tonight, I'd light the lantern, pull the book toward me, and read. Sometimes I read in silence. Sometimes I murmured the sentences aloud, testing how they felt in the air again. And sometimes, when one of them lifted its head toward me like a dog hoping for a hand on the neck, I'd pick up the pencil and answer. To the sailor who wrote in 1972 that you couldn't remember the shape of your daughter's hands, I wrote one fog-wrapped Tuesday. I hope you've seen them again, even if only in someone else's. To the honeymooners of 1988, I scribbled on a day when the sea was the exact color of their described oyster silk dress. You wrote that you couldn't imagine ever arguing here. I hope you learned that love can survive even the arguments. To the daughter in 2001 who scattered her father's ashes in the cove, I added on a still morning. You said the tide took him without hesitation. I hope you've let the tide take some of your grief too. The replies weren't meant to fix anything. They were offerings, the way you leave shells on a windowsill for no other reason than they're too beautiful to be hidden away. In giving them, I was finding a strange kind of mending. Like every sentence I wrote to someone else was quietly stitching something inside me. One night, as I turned a page with the care you'd use to wake a sleeping child, a thin slip of paper slid out from the spine and floated to the floor. I bent to pick it up, my pulse pricking as if I'd just been handed a secret on purpose. It wasn't a page from the book. It was loose leaf, folded twice, edges worn soft. The pencil handwriting leaned hard to the right, as though it had been written quickly or under a pressure heavier than the writer could name. It read, "I don't know if I'm coming back to stay or to say goodbye. Either way, I'm bringing the answer. I think the light will know what to do with it. Maybe it's the kind of decision that belongs to a cliff's edge. No signature, no date. Just that, ending mid-thought, as if the writer had been interrupted, or had changed their mind before the last sentence could escape. I read it 3 times before setting it on the table, my fingers resting on the crease like I could keep the ink from cooling. Something about it lodged in my chest, the certainty that they were coming, paired with the uncertainty of why. It didn't read like a note abandoned by accident. It read like something meant to be found later, when the right eyes were ready. The light will know what to do with it. I glanced up toward the stairs. Even in the dark, I could feel the lantern room above me, a silent keeper, waiting. I didn't write a reply to the letter that night. I sat with it, letting it breathe in the quiet, the fog's soft fingers slipping under the door. My mind kept painting possibilities. A proposal, a farewell, a decision to live or to leave. Each version was a different weight in my palm. By morning, the note was still there. I slid it gently between the pages of the book, marking it with a scrap of ribbon so I could return to it. It was the same day I decided to start the garden. It wasn't anything grand, just a thin strip of dirt along the side of the lighthouse where the wind was kinder. I'd been carrying a packet of wildflower seeds in my bag since leaving the city. Back then, they'd been more of a daydream than a plan. Something I'd bought during a grocery run because the packet showed a meadow so riotously alive it made my tired chest ache. Mateo found me kneeling in the dirt that afternoon, gloveless, hair whipped across my mouth, trying to dig a respectable hole with a bent trowel I'd found in the storage trunk. "You planting an orchard?" he teased, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Just trying to give the front door a reason to smile," I said, brushing soil from my hands. He set the mugs on the step and crouched beside me, watching as I pressed the seeds into the earth. "You know the wind here has opinions, right?" "Let it," I said. "I'm planting stubborn ones." It felt almost ceremonial, the way I covered the seeds, patted the earth flat, and sat back on my heels. Something about putting life in the ground beside a place built to endure storms made the whole place feel less abandoned, like I'd nudged it a little closer to alive. That evening, the air smelled faintly of earth instead of only salt. I opened the guest book to the ribbon-marked page and, without overthinking, wrote beneath the unfinished letter, "If you brought your answer, the light is still here. So am I." The moment the pencil left the paper, I felt it. A steadying, like I'd finally stepped onto the right path after weeks of wandering close to it. The replies kept coming in the days that followed, each one a conversation across time. And with every reply, I felt less like a visitor in the lighthouse and more like one of its moving parts, a gear in the slow, patient clockwork of keeping watch. The book was listening, the walls were listening, and maybe, just maybe, I was finally learning to listen to myself. I didn't expect the past to walk up the path in a wool coat and a careful smile. But there he was, breath turned to smoke in the morning chill, one hand in his pocket like he was negotiating with his courage. The light had woken gray, the kind of clean, promising gray that makes edges look honest. I'd been outside with a dented watering can, tipping yesterday's collected rain across the thin strip of soil beside the door. The first green tips had appeared, just the shyest commas of life, but even that felt like a proclamation. The seeds I'd pressed into the ground had kept their promise in secret. Now they were practicing how to be visible. I heard boots and looked up. He was maybe mid-60s, thick hair gone to winter, a face that had been handsome and decided to be kind instead. He paused a few steps from me, squinting as if the lighthouse were answering a question he hadn't said out loud. "Morning," he said. His voice had the gravel of coastal men who've stored weather in their throats. "Morning," I echoed, setting the watering can down. "We don't open because we're not closed," I added, my usual joke, which was also true of a place that had never learned to be one thing at a time. "But you're welcome." He smiled, brief and crooked, like a postcard from a younger man. "Saw the notice in town about the restoration. Figured I'd come see if the old bones still hold." "They do," I said, patting the wall. Stubbornly. He glanced at the small garden patch. "You're giving it something pretty to look at while it waits for the rest of us." "That's the hope," I said. "Wildflowers are better at patience than people." He nodded like he knew that from experience. Then he took 2 slow steps closer and put his hand on the door frame, palm splayed. "Some people touch a lighthouse the way others touch an altar." He was one of those people. "I'm Erica," I offered. "Jonah," he said, and then, as if to clarify something he wasn't asked, added, "Haven't been up here since I was 20. "Then welcome back," I said, meaning it more than a greeter is supposed to. We went inside, the interior cool enough to suggest its own weather. The lantern on the table had yet to be lit. Morning didn't need it. But the room had taken on a habit of brightness, as if all the small flames I'd set down in words had learned to glow even without wicks. Jonah took the space in quietly. The stove, the work table, the spiral staircase, the shelf where the rusted lanterns had been rearranged into a less mournful quorum. He noticed the guest book as if it had called his name. People do that here. They move toward it with a certainty that seems older than their feet. I felt it before I knew it, a flirt of recognition like static. My mind leapt, unhelpfully organized. 1968, the letter that never came. Or 1972, the sailor who forgot the shape of his daughter's hands. Or 1994, the almost wedding with gulls for witnesses. The book is a room full of years. Any of them could be his. Is that? He asked, stopping himself as if to give me the chance to say no, to protect a magic he hadn't earned yet. It is, I said, guests of the light, since whenever a guest decided the light should have a book. He reached for it as carefully as men of his age reach for newborns, competent, gentle, highly aware of their own strength. He brushed the cover with his fingertips and then opened to the middle like he'd been told long ago to trust the book to take him where he needed to go. The pages fell in one clean breath to a place that made his face change. "Ah," he said softly, as people do when they meet themselves in the wild. He didn't sit. He stood with the book tilted, scanning, and then his mouth shaped a small, private "Oh." He swallowed. He went still. "Do you need the chair?" I asked, keeping my voice level in case the answer was yes. He shook his head, and the motion looked like a man saving something for later. "I wrote this," he said, tapping the top of the page with a knuckle. "November 1968. My God." His eyes skimmed again. "It's mine, all of it." The entry he'd found, my pulse had guessed it, was the single line that had knocked the breath from me weeks ago. "I am waiting for a letter that isn't coming." He was the one who had written the rest of it. The bit about how waiting for a letter isn't the same as waiting for a person, how imagination can turn into a kind of cruelty. I could see the young man inside the older one, the impatience, the injured pride, the boy's tough gentleness he'd tried to wear like armor and then like skin. He drew a breath and let it out with an audible, almost comical care. "I was 20, he said, as if defending himself against charges. "My Elena left for Boston. She said she needed a year. I told myself she'd write. I told myself I'd be the sort of man who would allow the letter to arrive without begging for it." He glanced at me with a rueful smile that made him briefly 30 again. I was not that sort of man. "You came here instead," I said. "I came here because I'd been here as a boy," he said. "My uncle did repairs for the town. I knew the light. I figured it would look at me and decide what was wrong with me. It didn't. It just listened." He flipped the page carefully, confirming the rest of his own words as if to ground himself in evidence. When his eyes slid down, they caught on my reply, the one written on that fog-hung night when the world had narrowed to the breath of paper and the bell of the sea. To the one who was waiting for a letter that never came, I'm here now, and I hope you found peace. He read it once, twice. The second time, something in his jaw gave way. When he lifted a hand to his face, it shook. An old trembling, not fragile, but earned. He didn't try to hide it. The gesture, thumb sweeping quickly under an eye, was the universal habit of men not taught young enough how to weep publicly, but forced into it anyway by the soft insistence of truth. He started, then stopped. He closed the book gently and set his palm on it, as if checking for a pulse. I never came back, he said without looking at me. Not once. I didn't want to find out what kind of man I'd been. The stove ticked, quietly settling. The sea did its old rehearsal at the cliff. I waited because the book has been teaching me how. I married someone else, Jonah said after a moment, still in that voice of carefully chosen gravel. Jillian. We had years, good ones. Life is full, that's the truth. But when you're 20, the first epic feels like the only one. Elena wrote eventually. The letter came. It was brief. She said she had fallen in love with Boston itself, which was a way of telling me I had lost to a city. I loved Jillian. She died 5 years ago. I don't say that for pity, He tapped the book again, affectionate. I want you to know that sometimes the letter does come and it still says no. I nodded. It felt like a ceremony. 2 people in a round room telling the old house that life had happened as it tends to. He looked up at me finally and found my face. His eyes were the blue of evenings that refuse to be night. Did you write this? He asked, hand on my sentence. I did. And you're you? As far as I know, I said. I got tired of waiting for my own letter from a life that wasn't answering. I came here I gestured, inadequate. To keep the light from getting lonelier. Something eased in him. Well, he said, the word a smile. You've done it a kindness. He opened the book again and read my sentence a third time, as if the repetition might turn it into a prayer or a pill. He nodded to it, not to me, then closed the cover softly and held the book against his chest. The pose was so exact to the way I sometimes hold it that I felt my ribs recognize the gesture. I was afraid to come back, he admitted, voice lower. It's silly, I know that. But this place... He glanced up toward the lantern room, the spiral of stairs, the hard, beautiful geometry of the lens. It keeps you honest. I didn't want to see myself like that, not until today. His eyes flicked to the door, to the sliver of garden poking green at the horizon. I saw your flowers and thought, all right then. If the door can bloom, maybe I can be brave enough not to pretend anymore. I wanted to say something formal and generous. Instead, what came out was simple. I'm glad you're here. He laughed, a soft bark. Me too, he said, against my better habits. We sat. I made tea because coffee felt too declarative. The kettle argued like always and then relented. I poured into mugs that did not match, one the scandalized blue, one a chipped white with a fading lighthouse painted in kindergarten strokes. He wrapped his hands around his mug and, without fuss, allowed himself to be a person who had come to be gentled. "Were you ever 20 here?" he asked, after the first mutual sip had consecrated the room. "I'm 29 here," I said, "but I've been 20 inside a lot of rooms that demanded more than I knew how to offer. I came because I was tired of being good at drowning." He winced and nodded like a person who had once tied a rock to his own ankle and called it responsibility. "Some of us drown politely," he said. "Makes less mess." We both smiled. The sea behaved itself. The wind did not. He turned the conversation to the restoration easily, as if giving me a rest. I told him about Matteo and the council, and the electrician wizard whose schedule was a constellation of maybes. I told him about the railing, about how the lantern glass looked smug after a good clean, about the day we discovered the blank guest book in the trunk and decided not to claim it for ourselves. I told him about the teenagers who'd drawn cats and mercy in the margins, the mother who had added, "I love you" beneath it like a cure. I didn't tell him about the note tucked between the pages, the unfinished letter about coming back with an answer. That felt like a secret with its own itinerary, but I thought about it, sitting there with Jonah, the past embodied in a coat that smelled faintly of cedar and bay. When he had drained his mug and been allowed silence long enough to not feel obliged to fill it, he set the cup down with a careful clink and stood. He went to the book once more and opened it to his page. This time he didn't read. He just rested his fingers along the edge like a man taking a pulse again, and then he looked at my sentence a last time. "The lighthouse finally wrote back," he said. It landed between us like an oar onto the floorboards of a small boat, solid, useful. I felt it in my chest. I felt it in the room. The walls have learned to accept a compliment on behalf of those who keep them. They did so now with a quiet expansion, the exact architectural equivalent of taking a deep breath. "Thank you," he added, and he made it the kind of thank you people don't say in grocery stores. He made it a thank you built from years of not being ready to say it. I didn't know I needed to know that boy was still inside me and that it's all right we didn't get what we asked for. I couldn't find a good speech. I settled for the truth. "The replies aren't just for the past," I said. "Turns out they're also for the living." He smiled. A whole face smile that brightened his winter hair with an old summer. "A lighthouse that writes back," he said again, amused now. "Who would have thought?" "I think," I offered, "the light has been answering all along. We just didn't leave enough space to hear it." We didn't touch. The room had already done the necessary closeness. He put the book back meticulously, as men taught to use their hands do. I walked him to the door. The day had tilted into better light. The water glittered at a respectful distance, like a guest behaving impeccably after being asked to leave once. He paused on the threshold and looked at the thin strip of garden, at the commas of green practicing their sentences. "What'd you plant?" he asked. "Cosmos and cornflowers," I said. "Something that will sway but not surrender. You'll get pinks and blues." He peered, pleased to know something useful. Years ago, Jillian planted foxgloves by our door. I hated them, thought they were bossy. Then she died, and the next summer I couldn't get rid of them and was grateful for their bossing. "Maybe that's the deal," I said. "We plant something we think we're choosing, and then it chooses us." He laughed again, the gravel turning briefly to bells. "I'll come back," he said, and made it a vow only to himself. "Maybe bring a foxglove for this door if the wind will allow it. I'll make it mind its manners," I promised. And he nodded, as if satisfied with the kind of person I was to say such a thing. He started down the path, then turned back as if the cliff had remembered one more thing. "Elena had handwriting like rope," he said. "Braided. If you find a page like that, if you ever read her here, tell her I got old and was mostly good at it." "I will," I said, without knowing if I could. Sometimes you accept a task from a stranger because you don't know yet how large it is. He lifted a hand, pocketed his other, and walked down into the particular light people carry when their past has been returned to them in a kinder key. I watched until the path flicked him into town. When the wind had finished saying his name to itself, I went back inside. The book lay with its own modest gravitas on the table. I touched the cover. I opened it to our page and read our little duet again. My sentence, then his declaration about the lighthouse finally writing back. I felt the urge to add a line, to narrate the moment into permanence, but I didn't. It already was permanent in the way that matters here. It had been said aloud to the listening walls. This place keeps those too. Instead, I turned to the ribbon and took out the folded, unfinished note, the one from no year, no name, promising a return with an answer. I smoothed it on the table, the crease memorized already by my hands. The timing of Jonah's arrival made the note feel hotter, as if proximity had turned it into a live coal. I read it again, then again, until the single paragraph felt like a room I could walk around in blind. I don't know if I'm coming back to stay or to say goodbye. Either way, I'm bringing the answer. I think the light will know what to do with it. I breathed with it. The day had gone generous. The stove clicked. The water rehearsed its vowels. And I realized, quiet, decisive, that I had been waiting too. Not for a letter, but for the proof that my replies weren't only ceremony. Today, Jonah had brought that proof in his winter hair and his careful smile. I carried the note upstairs to the lantern room. The glass had that smug shine it got after a wipe, pleased with its own clarity. I stood with the note and looked at the world in its round. The boats like commas, the horizon like a sentence that refused to end prematurely. I held the note up. It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't a demand. It was a small offering, the way you show a child a shell you found and wait for them to gasp. "I'll be here," I told the lens, and my voice echoed in a tidy, affectionate way. "If they bring the answer, I'll be here." The wind pressed its face to the glass. The room felt like the anchor in a pocket watch. When I came down, I lit the table lantern, though noon was still bright. Because there are days when you allow yourself a little unnecessary flame. I took the pencil and wrote beneath someone else's old, steady words, this time under a 1988 couple who had written in newlywed joy that they couldn't imagine ever arguing here. "Sometimes," I wrote, "the argument is the way you find your way back to each other. The light reaches the rocks by colliding with the dark first." I closed the book. I went to the door. The garden's tiny commas had added 2 more exclamation points while I'd been upstairs. Ridiculous, unscientific, immediate life. I knelt without thinking and pressed my finger into the soil to make room for a new seed. I didn't know if it would take. That was never the point. The point was the ceremonial push of hope into dirt, the tenderness of giving the wind something to gossip about besides our mistakes. In the late afternoon, Matteo arrived with a box of brass screws and a lopsided grin. "Council says yes to the bench by the south window," he announced, triumphant. After 45 minutes of arguing about whether benches encourage loitering and whether loitering is just sitting without a purpose. "Isn't that called resting?" I said. "Depends on who's doing it," he said, and then peered at my face the way he peers at a bolt that might strip if coaxed too hard. "You look like you've seen a ghost you'd invite for tea." "A visitor," I said. "Jonah. He wrote an entry in 1968. He came back today." And we were both people, and it was enough. I hesitated, then added, "He read my reply. He said it felt like the lighthouse wrote back." Matteo leaned against the door frame and let his head touch the wood. "That'll do," he said into the grain. "That'll do nicely." We put the screws into places screws had wanted to be for years. The work was close and specific, the way good kindness is. When the bench was set and the sun had decided on gold for the evening's theme, we dragged it near the south window and sat on it like 2 mechanics admiring a newly coherent engine. He glanced at the garden. "They're showing off," he said of the green commas. "Let them," I said. "They've earned it." We didn't light the lantern. the day didn't need it. But the room had that new habit of brightness I couldn't help noticing, born not of sunlight, but of purpose. Jonah's words had joined the others in their ongoing work. The replies were not only for the pages that made them necessary, they were for the hands and mouths still alive, for Jonah in his winter coat, for the teenager drawing cats, for the mother writing, "I love you" like a rope across a dropped bridge, for Mateo, who listens to wind and screws, for me, who came here because I didn't know how else to be a person without dissolving. As the sky set itself on slow fire and then politely put itself out, I went to the table one more time. I didn't write anything. I just placed my palm on the cover and felt the book's quiet heat rising into my hand. "Thank you for listening," I said, "because sometimes you have to say it aloud to keep the magic from getting shy." The ocean answered in its native language. The lighthouse didn't speak because it doesn't have to. It did what it always does. It held, it watched, it kept. And in the keeping it taught me, as surely as any teacher with chalk and a lesson plan, that the past will come when it's ready, the living will come when they're brave, and the little seeds you tuck into the world will push their tiny faces up into light the first chance they get. The next morning when I stepped outside with the watering can, a single bold green stem had straightened itself taller than the rest. I touched it with one finger like you touch a miracle you don't want to scare. The wind leaned in, curious. I smiled, and for the first time since my life broke and I came here to stand inside its quiet, I felt a confidence I didn't need to narrate. If he comes back with the foxglove, I thought, there will be room. If the note's writer returns with the answer, there will be light. If no one comes at all for a week and the only new words are my own, there will still be listening. Some places hold their silence like a wall. This one listens like a friend. And that morning, with wet soil under my nails and the book breathing on the table and the bench ready for strangers to loiter at last, I realized the simplest truth the lighthouse had been making all along. The listening is the light. The replies are the beam. And every time we speak back, across years or inches, to someone who braved a page, we keep the coast from being lonely. I used to think light was a thing you switched on. Now I know it's also a thing you answer. Word didn't so much spread as it drifted, like fog moving through town, curling under doors, settling on shoulders. The phrase, "the lighthouse that writes back," began as a joke at the bakery. Ada said it first while slipping me an extra pastry, her voice pitched conspiratorial like we were planning a heist. Then the barista at the cafe used it, and the councilwoman who always wore a red scarf said it at a meeting with a shrug that meant, well, why not? A week later, I heard it from two college kids in thrifted jackets as they walked the cliff path, and one of them said, "That's the place I told you about." as if the lighthouse were a person he wanted his friend to meet. People came, not in a parade, not in a rush, more like the tide, arriving with their own rhythms, leaving something small behind and taking something small away. Some stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping in. Some headed straight to the table like they'd been practicing this all their lives. A fisherman I'd seen around town came one morning before the sun shook itself awake. He smelled of diesel and salt and a clean, hard-working kind of tired. He wrote 4 lines and drew a boat with a belly too full. Then he stared at what he'd written like a man who'd forgotten his own handwriting. He didn't ask me to reply. He left knowing I would. A school bus came on a Tuesday with a teacher named Miss Doll who looked like she carried a rainstorm and a rainbow in her tote bag. The kids were good in the particular way of kids who understand sacred spaces without having the word for it. One boy whispered to me, "Is it true?" And I asked him what part. "The writing back," he said, eyes too big for his worry. "It is," I told him. He nodded, thinking. He wrote, "Today I didn't cry at school," and then drew a square around it, as if to keep it safe. Miss Doll wrote, "I am trying hard to do right by them," and I added quietly beneath her entry, "I can tell." Sometimes travelers stumbled in when the weather turned on them. A couple from Nebraska soaked through to their bones. They left a note that said, "The ocean is louder than our arguments, and we're grateful." And I poured cocoa into 2 chipped mugs and wrote, "May your quiet be as strong as your storm." A woman with a guidebook wrote about her grandmother's kitchen in Maine and cried like it was legal to do so. A teenager with pink hair put down a lyric from a song I didn't know, and then, sheepish, added, "I want to be kinder than I was last year." It felt like watching people hand their hearts to a room and see the room hand them back just slightly lighter. Mateo took to calling me the keeper of replies, which made me roll my eyes and feel seen in the same breath. He installed a lock on the door that didn't stick, and a bell that made a sound like a spoon tapping a glass. The gentlest kind of announcement. He brought a carpenter on a blustery afternoon, and together they built a slim display case along the north wall out of reclaimed wood that felt right beneath the hand. "For the old book," Mateo said, sanding the edge like he was courting it, "and for the person who needs to know their words won't go wandering." The garden at the door kept its small, insistent promises. First the tips, then the leaves, then the thin cheeks of buds. One evening I came up the path and nearly tripped over a foxglove planted carefully at the end of the row. Tall, unapologetic, the same bossy purple Jonah had described. No note. I didn't need one. I touched the stem with 2 fingers and said, "Thank you," into the wind, which always passes on your messages if your requests are humble enough. That night I opened the guest book to our page, Jonah's lonely 20, my fog night reply, his simple blessing that the lighthouse had written back, and felt something in me finish mending in a place so deep I'd stopped looking for it. I added nothing. Not all healing wants narration. Some of it wants silence and the sound of paper breathing on the table. I had changed in ways even my old self would recognize. The edges that used to spark like exposed wires were smoothed with ordinary work. My days had depth instead of noise. I woke in the attic apartment above the bakery to the small symphony of people preparing bread, the hum, the low conversation, the clank of trays, and I felt like a citizen of a life rather than a consumer of it. I was not cured of everything. I don't believe in that word anymore, but I was rooted. The lighthouse gave me a place to plant sentences and seeds. Both took. People began asking if we were open, as if there were hours for the kind of listening we were doing. I put a sign on the door anyway, because people like instructions. Come in when the door is ajar. If it's shut, knock soft. The sea will answer first. I'll be right behind it. The council printed postcards to raise funds, each one with a different line from the book, cleared by those who signed their names. The cafe set out a small tin that read, "On the days you can't say it out loud, say it here," and handed me folded slips now and then like smuggled goods. I'd bring them to the lighthouse and tuck them gently between the pages. When I had the right words, I wrote back. When I didn't, I underlined the line that needed a second heartbeat and let that be enough. The unfinished letter, the one promising a return with the answer, became a tide in me. I carried it upstairs to the lantern room on mornings when the horizon looked stern, and I read it by the smug glass on afternoons when the water lay there pretending to be harmless. It changed, the way sentences can change when you move them through different light. Some days it sounded like courage. Some days it sounded like goodbye. I didn't know which version of its writer would walk through the door. I only knew I was becoming the person who would be steady when they did. The first time I called the place "we" out loud, I was sweeping sand from the corners. "We're getting there," I told the room, and didn't feel silly. It answered by being itself, a structure that holds, a lens that remembers, a staircase that insists on one step at a time. I had gone from burned out and untethered to that word I once suspected belonged only to people who owned houses or raised children. Rooted. My roots were thin and stubborn and saltwater tolerant. They tapped into community and into whatever aquifer of old words and braveries runs beneath towns that take care of one another. On a Saturday that wore the kind of blue that makes painters despair and poets lie, we held a small gathering. The council called it Community Day. I called it a soft opening for the light. Mateo rigged streamers the color of practical joy. The electrician wizard, satisfied with his work on the rails and determined to denounce bureaucracy by being meticulous, flipped a test switch with a flourish and declared, Safe enough to keep us honest. People brought what they bring. A crock pot of chowder, a bag of rolls, a plate of lemon bars that nearly caused diplomatic incident when we realized there were only 12. Ada from the bakery cried while laughing and called me our lighthouse girl, which made me feel 14 and ancient at once. We placed the original guest book in the display case. I wiped my fingerprints from the glass with the hem of my sweater and felt a tug of grief that surprised me. The book had become a person in my hands. Now it would become a relic, protected not because it was done, but because it had done so much. I rested my palm on the wood and said thank you in the language I'd learned here. A quiet aloud. People filed past and put their fingers to the glass, leaving smudges I didn't immediately clean. It felt right that the living left their prints on the memory of the words. Then I brought out the new book. It was simple and sturdy, its leather unscarred, its pages thick with the promise of listening. I had spent an evening by the south window choosing a pencil that wouldn't tear the paper and drawing a small lantern on the title page. Just an outline, nothing fussy. I wrote in my careful hand the first line, "Write what's on your heart. Someone will answer." Beneath it, on a narrow ribbon of paper, I added, "If you cannot write, rest. The light knows your language." We left it open on the table. It looked both brave and shy. People approached like you do when a baby is sleeping, not wanting to wake it in the wrong mood. A teenager, the cat artist, wrote first. She scrawled, "I got the job," then drew a star. Her mother added, "You did that," underneath, and pressed her cheek to the girl's hair in a gesture that would have made me weep even if no one had been watching. A couple visiting from Chile wrote in Spanish, "You made us think of our old neighborhood. We will walk slower from now on." A man I knew only by sight wrote, "I am 30 days sober today," and I wrote back, quietly in the evening lamplight, "The sea keeps count with you." Not all entries asked for answers. Some were declarations to self, some were apologies that needed a wall to hear them. A few were jokes, because people saved themselves that way too. The lighthouse received them without hierarchy. I answered when a reply would help. I left the rest to the space between the lines. That night, after the last paper plates had been regretted and the streamers had given up their bright cause one by one, I stayed. Mateo stacked chairs in small acts of kindness and whistled a tune that promised sleep. "You good?" he asked, and I nodded the way you do when good is deeper than fine. He clapped the door frame as he always did, a ritual he refuses to explain, and left the cliff to my keeping. It was Sunset's turn to perform one of its old tricks. The lamp in the lantern room glowed with a soft, steady authority that had nothing to prove. We weren't a navigational aid anymore, not officially. I knew the document numbers by heart now. But some lights don't ask for permission to be useful. We lit the lamp on evenings when the fog seemed nervous or the town seemed tired. It glowed like a long breath held without strain. Waves crashed below in their deliberate grammar. The garden nodded yes to everything, to the wind, to the light, to the way day slides into night without asking. I opened the original book in its case, and with hands that reverenced and shook in approximately equal measure, lifted it carefully to the table. I set it where it had learned to live, the center, where elbows wore the wood, where flour from Ada's apron had dusted the edge last week, where a teenager's bracelet had left an indigo smudge. I turned the pages slowly, the way you walk through an old house to say goodbye to each room. There they all were, decades standing shoulder to shoulder like neighbors at a parade. The man waiting for the letter, the woman with the ring and the splinter, the soldier who ate sandwiches in the quiet, the teacher who prayed without kneeling, the girl who drew the whale tail, Jonah's line and my reply, and his laughter folded into the words like a note tucked into a pocket for later, the mermaid we didn't see, the mother's "I love you" that bridged a square of paper with a rope no storm could cut. I found the unfinished letter and read it again, and this time it sounded less like a cliffhanger and more like a compass. I don't know if I'm coming back to stay or to say goodbye. Either way, I'm bringing the answer. I think the light will know what to do with it. It had. The light had done what lights do. It kept steady while we decided which way to go. In the weeks since that note slid onto my lap, I'd watched decision after decision arrive in small forms. Someone choosing to speak, someone choosing to sleep, someone choosing to forgive, someone choosing to try again. The answer didn't always look like ending or beginning. Often it looked like continuing, and I had come to believe that continuing is the bravest verb. I took up the pencil. The room breathed. The sea applauded and scolded simultaneously, as seas will. The lamp held me like a gentler sun. I wrote my final reply in the old book. I came here lost. Thank you for helping me find my way home. I pressed my palm to the sentence and felt the warmth of my hand leak into the page. My old life flickered through me, the office lights always a notch too bright, the client emails that picked at me like seabirds, the careful conversation in the kitchenette where a man I'd loved tried to be kind and succeeded in being honest. The woman I'd been last winter would not have recognized this version of me. A person who swept and answered and planted foxglove against a cliff's opinion, but she would have wanted to. I slid the book back into its case. The glass reflected a version of my face softened by lamplight and the sort of tired that means you did your work. I locked the case with the key that clicked in a satisfied way and turned to the new book waiting open, its first page already a small celebration of the living. I tied the pencil a little shorter so it wouldn't thump against the table when wind got ideas. I straightened the chair without making it look like I had straightened the chair. Then I climbed to the lantern room because it was sunset, and that's what you do when you live with a light. The stairs learned my steps, the rail learning my hand. The glass circled me with the world. The water flashed its teeth and then smiled. The town below held a scatter of windows beginning to glow, other rooms agreeing to be safe havens for a while longer. I set my palm on the brass and whispered names I'd learned here. Jonah, Ada, Miss Doll, Mateo, the pink-haired girl who took a job and a star, the fisherman who drew the two-full boat, the mother whose 3 words built a bridge. I included, snug among them, the woman I'd been when I arrived, tired, thin-skinned, almost silent, noisy inside, brave enough to come anyway. I told the light what I tell myself now when the wind tries to turn me back into weather. Keep steady, that's all. Keep steady. Someone came up the path then, footsteps quick, like a decision that had finally gathered its coat. I didn't hurry down. I wanted them to make it to the door and read the sign and come in on their own terms. I wanted the bell to ring its spoon-on-glass sound. I wanted to walk down and say, "Welcome, we're open because we're not closed." I wanted to watch them approach the table, settle, and write what needed writing on a page that had been waiting exactly this long for them. The lamp glowed softly while the waves negotiated with the rocks below. The foxglove nodded grandly. The wildflowers, those stubborn commas, had begun to write entire sentences in the soil. The bench by the south window had learned to hold strangers like old friends. I stepped back from the glass and started down the stairs, and I felt the lighthouse speak again in the language I know best now, a steady quiet that makes room. The words weren't words. They were floorboards and breath, and the grip of the railing and the pencil ready on its string. They were the town hum in the distance, and the slam of a car door, and the bell on the lintel, and the intake of breath a person makes when they realize it's safe to say what they came to say. The door opened, the bell chimed. I reached the last step and moved into my place, at the table beside the book in the life I hadn't known how to want. The visitor looked up, eyes wide the way eyes are when they meet their lives halfway. "Hi," I said, with the ease of someone who has let go of performance. "I'm Erica. Write what's on your heart. Someone will answer." The lamp burned. The waves spoke. The lighthouse listened. And the line I had written in the old book warmed under the glass like an ember that didn't need tending anymore. I came here lost. Thank you for helping me find my way home. And that ends tonight's meditation. You're welcome to stay for a bit longer if you like. Have a beautiful night. Until next time.